Welcome back. The death of George Floyd last May highlighted the issue of police brutality as people all over the nation rallied for change. The trial for the officer involved in Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin, is taking place now. Chauvin faces third and second degree murder, as well as second degree murder for manslaughter charges in the death of George Floyd. We're speaking with Jodi Morales, a criminal defense attorney, to help explain the details of the trial. And we are filming this on April 13th, so we will be discussing what has transpired during the trial up until that date. Jodi, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, just to start off, what is the key evidence influencing the trial at this point?
At this point, we've got a lot of medical testimony. These are probably the most important pieces. As you know, there's been testimony from a number of medical experts. And while people think that there's a difference of opinion here in terms of the first medical examiner's issuance of the cause of death, as opposed to what other medical experts have testified to, actually, there isn't much of a difference. What he did indicate in his first report was that there were a number of other things, underlying issues that contributed to the cause of death. However, he still ruled it a homicide. So I think that has been a huge sort of question for most people. And I think it's something interesting to talk about just in terms of a defense perspective and strategy. Of course, this is a case that was covered in the media. You saw video, and the defense has a very difficult time proving or disproving the prosecution's case. So they're going to take advantage of any little piece of evidence they can in order to try to poke holes in the prosecution's case.
And, right now, the main question is whether Floyd died from Chauvin's knee on his neck or on his back, or the drugs in his system. So medical experts, yeah, like you said, are definitely playing a key role in this case. What is causing so much confusion over the cause of his death?
Well, again, we have to go back to that first medical examiner, the person who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Baker. He testified that heart disease and drugs contributed to the cause of death. So in other words, he's saying that the heart disease, his narrowed arteries, and drug use played a role in the death. But he's not saying that that is the cause of death. He's saying that it's just a role. Okay. The actions by Officer Chauvin were the actual things that caused the death. So, I think people hear that and they hear the initial report from Dr. Baker and they think that there's some sort of a loophole here, or that he's, stepping away from this idea that excessive force was used. That's not what's actually happening. He's saying that there was an underlying and other contributing factors that led to Mr. Floyd's death.
Now, Minneapolis paid $27 million to the family of George Floyd to settle the wrongful death suit filed by the family. What could this mean for Chauvin's trial?
I think you've got people looking at it like, oh, well, then that means that the family is yielding, or, there's some issue. There's something wrong with the evidence against Chauvin. I think that's a natural impulse when you hear about a settlement. But what we neglect to think about when it comes to the civil side of things, civil cases, is that these cases take a very, very long time to come to a resolution. And sometimes there are a number of factors that, personal factors that the family has to consider in terms of, whether they want to pursue something that's going to last for a very long time, or whether they want to sort of shut the door and close on one critical aspect of what happened and sort of, put more emphasis and energy behind what's happening in the criminal case.
And, what are some of your thoughts on the witnesses called to stand? In particular, we had the law professor, Mr. Stoughton's testimony. What exactly are your thoughts on the witnesses they're calling?
Well, I think Professor Stoughton was an amazing witness for the prosecution. I mean, not only is he a former police officer, he's a law professor who's an expert in the use of force. So, his testimony is extremely powerful. He testified that Chauvin overlooked cues nearly every step of the way during this arrest, and that he escalated the situation into a deadly use of force. And that should have never happened. There's no reason to take it to that level. So his expertise as an officer, as well as someone who analyzes specifically the use of force, is something that I think the prosecution is going to yield a lot of benefit from. Of course, the other witnesses have been extremely influential and very important for the prosecution. I mean, cardiologist Dr. Rich, he testified that but for that restraint, he would have lived. George Floyd would have lived. He testified, and I think he actually said his death was absolutely preventable. When you hear that type of evidence and that type of testimony from someone who's had the benefit of not only reviewing the medical records, but also the body camera footage, it's irrefutable evidence in my view. Of course, we also have to consider the family. I know his brother testified, and it was a very powerful and emotional moment. And that's something also that the prosecution was very smart to do, because we are human beings. This is a case, but at the end of the day, people need to understand who this person was and why the impact of what happened is so great.
And do you think that the fact that this case is, it's literally known like around the world, we had protests over it last year. Do you think because this case is so well known, will that affect the verdict of the case? And if so, how do you think it will affect it?
I think it's certainly, the notoriety, all of the coverage, I think it certainly puts pressure on the jurors to do the right thing, so to speak. I think nobody wants to feel like they acquiesced in behavior that was totally excessive. And of course, the protests have shown a very bright light on some of the atrocities that have been happening in our country. So I think that, people are very, very upset to a degree that will impact generations to come. And right now, the pressure is very high for the jurors to do the right thing. Of course, a guilty verdict doesn't bring him back, but it does, make a huge statement about what's acceptable in communities of color and what's not.
And most recently, now we have the shooting of Daunte Wright, which just happened as this trial is going on. How do you think that this is going to affect the trial?
I think it certainly has an effect and an influence on the trial. You're going to see more pressure on the prosecutor, on the jurors from, community members, people just like you and I, who are looking at what is transpiring outside of this case and saying, when is this going to stop? When does this end? And when you have that as the backdrop to some of the testimony that you've heard in this particular case, you can't help but assume that this is going to definitely have a strong impact on how the evidence is being weighed.
And right now, there is talk of sequestering the jury due to civil unrest following the death of Daunte Wright. While these are two separate cases, do you think the jurors, in relation to the George Floyd case, do you think they could be in possible danger because they're so close to that?
I wouldn't say that they're in danger, but I think that there's definitely a fear of influence. Now, the jury is supposed to just listen to the evidence and make their decision based on the evidence presented. Of course, when there's all this other stuff going on in the background and many different voices and many different opinions registering, it has an impact on the jury. And I think that although the judge recently denied sequestering them yesterday, I believe there was a request by the defense attorney to sequester the jury yesterday, and the judge denied it. It's my understanding that when deliberations come, the judge will be sequestering the jury.
And, when you're looking at this trial, is there anything that you see that you would do differently as a criminal defense attorney?
No, I think that there is such overwhelming evidence in support of the prosecution's case that, presenting the evidence as it's there and as it had unfolded is just the perfect way to do it. I don't think that there's any reason to call, additional witnesses outside of who has already been called and muddy the waters. It's very clear. There is video evidence of what transpired. There are medical experts discussing the cause of death. And there's nothing else really to consider. I mean, in my view, this conversation about, drug use and, heart condition and things like that, sure, it's something that needs to be discussed, but it's, again, not the cause of death here, at least from the evidence that I've seen. So getting back to the original question, there isn't anything I would do differently from the prosecution's perspective.
And how can folks get in contact with you for other, if they want to, reach out to you as a criminal defense attorney?
Sure. So the easiest way is on Instagram. You can find me at J Morales Law. You can also email me. The email is Jodi, Jodi, at jlmoraleslaw.com.
And once again, we just want to remind our viewers we are shooting this on April 13th. So we are discussing topics that have transpired during the trial up until the 13th. We will be right back.